Stephen Ross is one of the most prolific businessmen in the country today. You might know him as the man behind the Hudson Yards redevelopment project, or the guy with his name on the University of Michigan's business school, or, as most people think of him, the owner of the Miami Dolphins. But no matter how you are familiar with Stephen Ross, you probably know that he's a straight-up billionaire. Well, the man who's reportedly worth at least $10.1 billion is about to get a whole lot richer. According to Bloomberg News, Stephen Ross is in advanced talk to sell 13% of his sports portfolio. This includes portions of the Miami Dolphins, Hard Rock Stadium, the Formula One Miami Grand Prix, and even a piece of Ross's 50% ownership stake in the annual Miami Open tennis tournament. Yeah, it's a lot. Now, the deal hasn't been finalized yet, and it's very possible that it won't go through at all. We saw Ross previously put together a framework agreement with billionaire Ken Griffin to buy a stake in the Dolphins, only for it to fall through after Griffin requested a path to majority control at the last minute. However, if the agreement does get finalized, it will be a huge deal for two reasons. Number one, it values the assets at $8.1 billion. And number two, Ares Management would be purchasing a 10% stake alongside Brooklyn Nets owner Joe Tsai, acquiring the other 3% equity position. Now, why is that second point so important? Well, it would make Ares Management the first ever private equity firm to buy a stake in an NFL team. If you don't remember, NFL owners voted to change the league's rules earlier this summer, pre-approving a handful of private equity firms to acquire small, passive equity stakes in up to 6 NFL teams each. This rule change was seen as a win-win for everyone. NFL owners, they get a little bit of liquidity. Team valuations continue to rise thanks to increased demand, and private equity managers get to rake in lucrative management fees on an illiquid asset with a long track record of price appreciation. That's also not necessarily correlated to the broader equity market. Basically, everyone got to make a whole hell of a lot more money. What's even more interesting, though, is what this means for other sports owners. Stephen Ross has changed the game on compounding capital via professional sports in the 21st century. As a real estate mogul at heart, Ross made sure his $1 billion purchase of the Miami Dolphins included the team's stadium. And while that might seem like common sense and standard operating procedure for NFL owners, it's actually quite uncommon. Out of the 32 NFL teams, only 5 of them own the stadium in which they play. Most franchises, even behemoths of the league, like the Dallas Cowboys, Chicago Bears, and Green Bay Packers, pay millions of dollars in rent every year because their stadium was partially paid for with taxpayer dollars. And you thought your landlord was bad.
You said it, the rent is too damn high.
While having a government-owned stadium does have some benefits, mainly tax write-offs and lower operating costs, owning a stadium and the surrounding land has become an increasingly critical competitive advantage, and the Miami Dolphins are a perfect example of why. Simply put, while Stephen Ross might have to deal with higher operating costs at Hard Rock Stadium, he's able to use the property for whatever he wants when the Dolphins aren't playing at home. Think about it this way. Not including the playoffs, which, let's face it, it isn't in the cards this season for the Dolphins. The Miami Dolphins have 8 or 9 home games every year. So what do you do to take advantage of the remaining 357 days of the year without a Dolphins game? Well, you fill it with premium events like Taylor Swift's Eras Tour, college football playoff games, or multiple matches for the upcoming 2026 World Cup. That's what you do. It's not just the physical stadium that brings in cash either. Hard Rock Stadium sits on 250 acres of land. For some perspective, that's about a quarter of Central Park. So aside from parking and public transportation, Stephen Ross and Dolphins president Tom Garfinkel have started to take advantage of all that space, building out a portfolio of events like the Miami Open tennis tournament and Formula One's Miami Grand Prix that utilize the stadium's parking lot and surrounding land. The Formula One race is particularly fascinating because it's an entirely new event, something that literally didn't exist until Ross and Garfinkel dreamt it up. While they might have had to put up a significant sum of money to prepare for the race, they signed a 10-year deal with Formula One, so the race will be a mainstay in South Florida for at least a decade. And boy, did that investment work out. Here's what Tom Garfinkel told me last April about the turnout.
From a business standpoint, the ticket revenue for the race, we had the highest ticket revenue in the history of the Dolphins this past season. The ticket revenue for the race is about 25% more than the entire Dolphins season.
For the one rule, the weekend of
the
it.
one weekend, yeah.
Yeah. It's an event you net added, basically. It wasn't existing 4 years?
Yeah, it didn't exist. It was in the parking lot, and we had parking lots, and now it's this event.
For context, the ticket sales for a team like Miami is probably around $150 million annually, which means that 25% more than that is around $185 million annually. Now, I'm not a mathematician, but I'm pretty confident that's a big number to add to your total revenue. Events like the Formula One race are a big reason why Stephen Ross is attracting investors at a valuation of $8.1 billion. Sports assets have been appreciating a lot over the last 2 decades. Most of that was because of higher than anticipated media rights deals. But since those deals are now locked in, owners now need to look for new revenue sources to keep their businesses thriving. Ross isn't the only pro sports owner who's recognized this trend. Mark Cuban appeared on the All In podcast and explained why he decided to sell his majority stake in the Dallas Mavericks.
One, when I first bought in 2000, I was the tech guy in the NBA. I was the media guy. I had every edge in every angle. Now, fast forward 24 years later, in order to sustain growth, to be able to compete with the new collective bargaining agreement, you have to have other sources of revenue. And so you see other teams, and all sports for that matter, talking about casinos, talking about doing real estate development. That's just not me. I wasn't going to put up $2 billion to get an education on building. If we're able to build a Venetian type casino in Dallas with an American Airlines Center in the middle of it, the valuation is $20 billion. But I own 27% of that.
So my point is simple. While everyone keeps talking about real estate development projects and casinos like the Battery in Atlanta or Texas Live in Arlington, Miami Dolphins owner Stephen Ross has proven that there is more than one way to increase revenues. By investing in not just the team itself, but the entire infrastructure surrounding it, Stephen Ross has successfully positioned the Dolphins as a holding company, building them into one of the world's most valuable sports properties today.